So hello, everybody. Just coming up this Monday, of course, second test. So be ready to take that on Canvas. That'll be the material that I've covered since the last test. So it's not comprehensive, does not include material before test number one, but rather touches upon this material, religion, politics, the economy last time, and today's class on the economy. So be thinking about that. In the class today, I'm going to look at the rest of the material on the economy. Moving forward, I don't know if we'll get through all of this today, but hopefully a good portion of the contemporary economy. So I'll just finish up a little bit with what I was talking about last time. I said previously that today manufacturing only accounts for about 10% of the economy in Britain, which is fairly typical for a lot of countries in the Western world, and obviously a transition from the case in, say, the Victorian era. And I suppose you could say that that's a cause of anxiety for Britain, as well as a lot of other countries, because there is this idea that if you have a manufacturing base, it gives you something more concrete and tangible, especially if it is something that touches upon, say, natural resources, because that is something substantial that the nation itself might possess. The thing with a service-based economy is there's this impression that it's easier to get other people to perform those services. So this kind of intangibility of the modern economy has been a growing source of anxiety and concern. And I would say it infiltrates just about every sector in the 21st century in a country like the UK, which I'm going to speak about further. And we can see this with the financial services, which I'll speak about briefly. You see a breakdown of total GDP in various countries. GDP, as I mentioned, is basically the total amount of wealth in the nations. See the United Kingdom still one of the wealthier countries in the world today. Big story recently over the past several decades has been the startling rise of China into a global economic superpower. That was not the case previously, which is reorienting, I guess you could say, the world economy as well as geopolitics. Mentioned financial services, which plays an influential role, doesn't account for a large portion of the British economy, but nonetheless is very influential, since here we are speaking about the corporate sector. Say there by 2007, the City of London was home to 250 foreign banks. The city, sometimes the term that's used just to describe the financial district, as this area emerged as a world leader in finance, with an extraordinary amount of money flowing through it on a daily basis. This is the ultimate service economy. The corporate sector and investment banking does not create something, does not manufacture something. Rather, it takes wealth that has already been earned and reinvests it. That's basically what it means. And there are a couple of reasons as to why London might be seen as this center for financial services. Here are just a couple of them. Stability, the political stability of Britain as a whole. As I mentioned, a country has not had a revolution since the late 1600s, which is unusual. The corporate world, investment banks, foreign banks, they love political stability. They like the idea of everything being on this even keel. They're certainly not interested in revolutionary upheaval and turmoil. They want everything to be stable. The language in Britain, English has emerged as the international language of commerce, and location as well, which is something that is often overlooked. Britain is able to hit the workday in both North America and Europe, and Asia to an extent as well, so it's kind of ideally situated. Also another factor, deregulation, but this speaks again to the anxieties of the modern economy. Of course, the corporate world, bankers love the idea of deregulation, which basically means less state intervention into the modern economy. They always regard those things as impediments to, quote, freedom, which basically means the freedom to allow the market to run its course. Less regulation you have, the more you'll have bankers kind of investing in the area. And yet, of course, the anxiety is that you could always potentially find less regulation in other places, lower taxes potentially, in other places, less state intervention. So this is the kind of rush towards that. Of course, if you have less regulation, then you also have more volatility within the economy, as well as just less state intervention in the country as a whole, which typically grows wealth inequality. So we're going to take a look at the economy and the 21st century, and there is obviously a lot to talk about because here we have a subject that permeates just about every single aspect of the course, and we've been talking about this in relation to various other subjects, but here I've just broken it down into a couple of big issues which I would say are very contemporary and pressing and touch upon personal issues as well as those that exist more just at the national and even the international level. Energy and the environment, land and housing, central banks and currency, and automation and the future of labor. So touching upon everything from the corporate world and currency to just the idea of work and the kinds of jobs that people have. I'll speak about energy and the environment, climate change and its consequences, and implementing change, a case study of petroleum. So here is a topic that obviously we've been hearing about a lot for a number of years now. Climate change that is being induced through human activity, and especially because of industrialization. There is generally thought to be this correspondence, and here you can see some of the notable impacts of climate change in a country like Britain. All sorts of different things, which I won't go through in detail, but basically generally impacting people's lives as well as weather patterns as a whole. But of course, this is also a global phenomenon. You see a map showing the potential impact of rising temperatures across the globe. If the net increase is 4 degrees Celsius with a corresponding 16 degrees Celsius increase in Arctic temperatures, because that's where you see the increase the most, just to show it a little bit closer so you can see it. And we've been hearing, of course, about these things such as heat waves, increasing forest fires, food shortages, droughts, water shortages, all of these things which are expected to increase over time, with climate change itself increasing over time. So here you see some of the impacts potentially in the future. And also sea levels as well. You see a projection of rises in sea levels up to the year 2300. And studies indicate that temperatures will continue to increase even after fossil fuels are eliminated, because there's a cumulative effect that will continue for a long time, as you can see, hundreds of years. And so, since we've been hearing a lot about climate change, there has been the issue of tackling environmental catastrophe. And here we run up against the conflicts and even the contradictions that exist in the modern economy. Now, of course, there have been attempts at cooperative agreements among different nations, probably most famously the Paris Agreement, which was in the news when Donald Trump withdrew the United States from it, and then Joe Biden, of course, put America back into it. And there you can see the goals to curb greenhouse emissions and prevent the average global temperature from increasing by more than 2% above pre-industrial levels. So here you have an attempt at what you might describe as a cooperative venture, but you also have a strong indication of the existence of realist politics, as it's sometimes called, which basically refers to the ongoing anarchy that exists at the international level. No real overseeing body, but just a group of nation states pushing their own agendas and kind of struggling against each other. The United Nations, to a degree, plays the role of an arbiter, but not necessarily one with central authority. And the Paris Agreement is that kind of agreement which exists on the international scale, and yet is not necessarily binding. It's not as though countries actually have to abide by what the Paris Agreement says. It's more an intention that they will do so. And so that's one issue. And the other thing with the Paris Agreement is that it explicitly states that countries are committed to the idea of reducing pollution, reducing carbon emissions, but without interfering with economic growth. There's this idea that individual countries should have the right to continue pursuing economic growth. Yeah, but the problem is economic growth is tied to industrialization in a lot of places. Industrialization is a kind of wealth-generating industry as a whole, and so this is a kind of check and balance that's been a struggle for a lot of places and is a kind of struggle on the international scale. A couple of different perspectives we can offer here. Here's from an article in The Guardian in 2017. I choose this because it's very representative, the kind of typical media assessment of climate change that you might be able to find in a lot of places. Degrowth might sound scary, but it's really not. All it means is easing the intensity of our economy, cutting the excesses of the very richest, sharing what we have instead of plundering the earth for more, and liberating ourselves from the frenetic consumerism that we all know does nothing to improve our well-being or happiness. As I say, a kind of typical perspective on the idea of just less growth and less excess, less plundering of the earth's resources. But here's another perspective from Paul Mason, who wrote the book Post-Capitalism, which was published in 2015. And he writes, the real absurdists are not the climate change deniers, but the politicians and economists who believe that the existing market mechanisms can stop climate change, that the market must set the limits of climate action, and that the market can be structured to deliver the biggest re-engineering project that humanity has ever tried. And a couple of very important points there. First of all, using the existing economic market to try to combat climate change, which has kind of been the assumption of what we can do through things like taxes or regulations or green energy incentives. I would essentially say that that is the direction things are going in. But Mason's point is effectively that the market doesn't necessarily allow for that kind of international venture. Yes, you can set things up on a smaller scale, but as a whole, the market is telling us that we need to consume more, that we need to burn fossil fuels, and that we need more industrialization. In other words, the market is not under our control in that way. It's a kind of process that runs almost independently of us, and our attempts to intervene it have not necessarily led in positive directions just yet. Also, the other thing he says, a giant re-engineering project. So it's kind of forcing us to admit that this is actually a major enterprise we're talking about here. If we're talking about reductions in industrialization, it's not a small thing, but rather a massive thing, and the difficulty of course, is international cooperation. I mean, you look at humanity as a whole, I mean, we do certainly have a kind of cooperative dimension to us, but we're also notoriously unable to agree on things. I mean, you look at conflicts and contrasts between different countries, different perspectives, different agendas. It's really difficult to imagine this kind of global sort of trajectory moving forward. So let's take a look at one of the case studies here to understand this conflict between the economy and the climate, which is not really a conflict so much as a kind of symbiotic relationship when we study it a little bit closer. You have the problem with fossil fuels getting to the essence and generating wealth. The problem with fossil fuels is something that has been self-evident for a long time, is that they're very polluting. I mean, this is basically the story when you talk about the petroleum industry or burning coal, for instance. Well, there you see global greenhouse gas emissions by particular sources. And you do have other things involved there, such as methane, for instance, which is commonly associated with livestock and other animals, but carbon dioxide coming prominently from fossil fuel and industrial processes. So basically, industry creates a lot of pollution and greenhouse gases, and that's not really a new story. If you go back to the origins of the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s, they were aware in Britain of all the black smoke and pollution that came from factories. It's not as though they were unaware of those things, commented on it at the time, something that was changing the scenery around them. So this is a kind of long-standing issue. It's only with more kind of in-depth studies today that we realize the full consequences and effects of them. See a depiction there of industry. We think about fossil fuels and exactly the role that they're playing for us. Well, I mentioned this previously. The thing with fossil fuels is that we can reduce it to a sort of basic essence if we're forced to. They are great fuels. You take coal, take petroleum, take even natural gas, for instance, and this is something that allows us to exercise a tremendous amount of control over the production of energy. And you could also even take it to a more kind of basic level, and I kind of always think in terms of these long continuities or threads, or like to think in terms of them. It's almost a way for us to perfect or hone our mastery of fire. I mean, we're not so different from the way we were 50,000 years ago, or even hundreds of thousands of years ago either. It's this kind of idea of exercising control over an aspect of nature and the environment, and these tremendous fuels that we have that are very efficient allow us to do something that our ancestors have been trying to do for a very long time. And take that from that kind of basic, almost primordial level and kind of raise it up to the level of modern society, exercising control over light, over heat, for instance. I mean, that's something we're still invested in today. Thus, insofar as that's the case, we as a species have become obsessed with fossil fuels, with petroleum, with natural gas, and with coal for a very long time. And I would say that this is something that not every country has been involved in, but many countries have been involved in. In fact, many people argue that this has effectively been the story not only of the modern economy over the course of the 20th century, but also geopolitical struggles and warfare as well have been fought over energy resources. And there has to be some kind of truth to that. When we look at the history of, say, the Second World War, war with Russia and Ukraine today, for instance, energy resources playing a huge role in the rationale of that war. And also, what about some of the wars in the Middle East, such as America's invasion of Iraq, which I'm going to speak about further, wars fought over energy resources. Britain has its own investment in its particular energy resources, the North Sea oil reserves. Estimates indicate that the remaining reserves might be worth 1.5 trillion pounds, though there is a debate about how much longer these reserves will last. 30 to 40 years is the usual estimate, and conflicts over who actually owns these resources. They've also been kind of caught up with the story of Scottish nationalism and independence. And you see an entire force worth of oil derricks at Venice Beach in California in the early 20th century. Here's a story that a lot of people might not know about. Los Angeles was originally an oil boom town. That's basically how LA got its first start. Today, we associate Los Angeles with all sorts of other things like Hollywood or tourism or a variety of other things, but it grew up originally due to the presence of petroleum there, and that became the kind of the substratum, the foundation for this place. It's not really an oil city anymore. That's basically how it got its start. And so too the case with a lot of other locations today. There's Dubai, United Arab Emirates, with their involvement in the petroleum industry. Again, less of a major factor today in the United Arab Emirates, but that is really a central factor in how this city, the desert, grew up so quickly with their access to this black gold wealth-generating resource. Doha, Qatar as well, another example of a city that grew up very quickly based on the substratum, the foundation of the fossil fuel industry. Mentioned the situation in Iraq. There you see United States Secretary of State Colin Powell holding a model vial of anthrax, one of the weapons Saddam Hussein's Iraq was supposedly developing, which justified the U.S. and U.K. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Wrong. Complete bunk. They were not developing weapons of mass destruction, nor did the Iraqi regime have ties to al-Qaeda, the terrorist organization, as was presented. No, this was effectively a war to secure Iraq's vast oil fields. I mean, that was basically the rationale. Not necessarily so America could plunder the oil fields, because that's not what they ended up doing, but to secure them, to take control of them, because it was a weakness, not just in the Middle East, but globally speaking, a weakness in Iraq's massive oil fields, which I forget how large they are, but I think they're something like the 5th largest of any country in the world, were in the hands of Saddam Hussein, a known enemy of the United States. Situation has altered a little bit with America trying for energy independence through the process of fracking, which basically means they're homegrown energy resources. Now, all of these points kind of get into something I think very interesting about the petroleum industry. We talk about the search for something material and tangible in the modern economy, like, say, a natural resource, something hard and solid that you can hold in your hands, as opposed to a service, which exists on a kind of more immaterial level, or as opposed to modern money as well. Because think about the way money is existing increasingly in this kind of abstract, ethereal realm. Everything is done online. I mean, a country like Iceland, the need to carry around paper cash is even not that important anymore. So money itself kind of circulates in this ethereal realm. So we like the idea of something very solid that we know has a lot of wealth and value attached to it intrinsically. That was the story of gold. It still is the story of gold today. The value of gold, well, you can always sell it to people anywhere around the world. Everyone loves gold. It seems to be this one thing that has this inherent value woven into it. So too with petroleum. That's become the story in the post-industrial society. Insofar as it's this great fuel energy resource, well, then it is a real wealth-generating industry. It justifies the kind of investment of resources in it, because once you set up your derricks or your factories or whatever it might be, and once you dredge the crude oil out of the ground, you have something not only that you can use yourself, but you can sell to other people, and they're always going to want it. It is indeed like black gold, basically playing that role in the modern economy, and that's why they list the price of the barrel of oil. And they're talking about stock prices as well, because it's sort of playing the role of gold or money today. And here we go, getting right to the heart of the issue with overproduction, fossil fuels, pollution, climate change. Paris Agreement claims to curb reliance on fossil fuels and limit carbon fuel burning to 886 billion tons between 2000 and 2050. That's the stated goal. I don't know if that actually will stop climate change, but it's a kind of intervention into it. Yet, there are 2.8 trillion tons of carbon reserves available, and probably more than that thanks to the development of fracking. Factoring current prices, total oil reserves alone could be worth over 100 trillion US dollars. In other words, the market is still saying it's valuable, it's worth something. So no matter what agreements we're coming to, there's still this kind of underlying question: are we really acting as though we're going to leave that 100 trillion US dollars just sitting in the ground? Is that really the kind of message that you see developing right now? Well, no. As I said, America's been investing in fracking because it's still a valuable resource that they want. And so, as long as the market is kind of pushing us in the opposite direction, we're just following that instead of really implementing meaningful change. And keep in mind, of course, it's not quite the same with green energy. Yes, you can use green energy, especially locally, which has been the case. And, of course, you can build, say, aluminum smelting factories that make use of local energy. But you can't send the wind to another place in the world. You can't send solar energy to another place, right, Bob? You can ship petroleum to another place. So it's a little bit different in terms of the money that allows local places, local regions to develop. And I don't know how we're going to resolve that. I mean, if green energy really actually takes off of its own volition, then that would be something that happens, but it's almost as though we're waiting for that to occur instead of being proactive about it. So they're on the level of industry. Let's look at something that is sort of personal and touches upon the lives of individual people, as well as being always a national and international issue simultaneously. This would be land and housing. Talk about the historical connection. Say in a country like Britain, residents account for an enormous amount of the total assets in the country, and a large portion of the economy is coordinated with real estate. It's not something we necessarily think about all the time, but it is in fact the case that a huge amount of just the wealth that exists in a material form is actually linked to housing. Value of houses always goes up, so home ownership is always a good investment in theory. Banks love mortgages, a bit too much so, as the 2008 crisis demonstrated. We'll talk about central banks and the bailout in the case of Iceland. That'll be for later when we get into the discussion of central banks. So an image I showed earlier, 15th century image of peasants at work. As discussed, in feudal Britain, peasants lived on the land, worked on it, raised families on it, and died on it, but they did not own it. And so we go back to just, again, fundamental questions. The more things change, the more things stay the same. So I've talked about, say, the mastery of fire from something in ancient history. Well, how about just land, right? A place to live. I mean, yeah, that's always been something that's occupied us. It's always important regardless of where we are. Well, we go back to the feudal social order. The ownership of land, which is equated with wealth and power, is concentrated in the hands of very few people. In terms of those who actually own the land, tiny fractional number of people, and you just have a bunch of people working on plots of land, surviving, and they don't actually own it. We have an idea that the situation is different here in the 21st century. The ownership of land, I guess you could say that it's more diverse today. We don't really think in terms of the idea of one person owning huge plots of land. We think more in terms of individual people owning plots of land, and we also think in terms of real estate. That's kind of what land has become. So it's not just the ownership of a patch of land in and of itself, but the stuff that's on the land, namely houses. And so there you see an overhead shot of London. You get that sense of the fragmentation, the way everything is divvied up. You almost have this idea, well, in the ideal scenario, you have, one family for one segment, and so all these people are owning their own little segments of land. Well, that, I guess you could say, would be the ideal. But notwithstanding the diversification of land ownership, there are a couple of caveats to throw in. I guess first and foremost among them is that even homeowners might not necessarily own their houses as such. Rather, the banks, right, own the houses, right, because you have to pay the banks for the mortgage. So you do kind of own it, but on the other hand, not really. And also, what about renters in a place like Britain? Well, they don't own the property. In fact, increasingly in a country like Britain, you have these big corporations, these big companies that buy up lots of real estate, lots of homes, and so the individual renter basically pays this company that actually owns the land. So it's not as diverse as the image would make it appear to be. Some people do actually pay off their mortgages, and thus they are outright owners of the house. But to a degree, it's still kind of hierarchical in terms of its larger divisions. Talk about the wealth of real estate. There you see a 5-bedroom home for sale in Kensington, London. This is one random thing that I found being sold for 24 million pounds. I don't know, that doesn't look like a 24 million pound house to me, but I guess it's all about location. In this instance, it's in Kensington, London, thus drives the price up incredibly. And as I said before, a huge amount of wealth in a country like Britain or a country like Iceland is coordinated with real estate. You want to talk about total assets in a country? Well, a lot of it's just tied up with housing, not only through individual ownership of property, but also just in terms of the infrastructure. And you can see this in a place like Reykjavik if you just walk around. Look at these big, giant construction projects that you see all over the place. What are they building? I mean, 9 times out of 10, or even more than that, housing. That's what they're building. They're building giant housing complexes. Why? Well, people need a place to live, yes, but they're lucrative as well. It's a good investment to build housing because of course, you'll have people to purchase the property. So I'd say it's become ever more important. And there's also this sense, too, you take a situation like London, you have a lot of people who want to live there, not just people from Britain, but also people from overseas. Indeed, people from overseas who might just buy the home and kind of use it to park their money in this particular location. Housing, a tangible asset and always a good investment. So if we live in the modern economy, a place where the idea of wealth has become something a little bit more abstract and ethereal, then obviously we're on the lookout for things that give us a sense of a material investment. I mean, that's even the anxiety about modern savings accounts, our money in a bank account online, and it just exists as a number on the computer screen. Doesn't always feel as kind of solid as it should. So we're looking for something, again, something you can touch or hold in your hand, something solid and material. And for a long time, housing has been playing that role. That is really the concrete investment that people are looking for. And there's been this sort of narrative that housing is always a good investment. Why? Well, because they always increase in value over time. That has been true, actually, for quite a long time. And think about that in contrast to the other things that you might purchase. Almost all other things that we buy, don't increase in value over time. They depreciate over time. Whether you're talking about our electronics, clothing, cars, just about anything except for what? Antiques. Stuff you buy and just stick on your shelf somewhere. But in terms of something that you're actually using, buying a home is something that you expect to be worth more money down the line. In fact, this has been the story of the kind of real estate market. Yes, invest in housing because it's always going to be worth more tomorrow than it was worth today. It's caught up, I would say, with the general capitalist mantra, which is one of unending growth and wealth accumulation. There you see the GDP per capita in England and the United Kingdom since 1270. Again, we can take these things a little bit with a grain of salt since we're going back a long way into the past. But obviously, since the time of industrialization, we'd have to say that the total amount of wealth that the country has, as well as that individuals have, has certainly skyrocketed. There's more wealth available today. The upward trend is something that we've come to rely on, something indeed that we have come to expect. Imagine if there was negative growth, negative economic growth in any country today. Britain, the United States, any country in Europe, it would be regarded as an absolute catastrophe. There's this idea of, no, we always have to have more wealth today than we had yesterday. We always have to be making more money today. And there's all sorts of, I would say, creative practices that are basically trying to generate the impression that that is the case. I'm not so sure that we are richer today than we were yesterday. I'm certainly not so sure that the standard of living is better today than it was yesterday. But there is this idea of, yes, bigger, better, more all the time. We're kind of indoctrinated into that thinking. And so it's comforting to think that there's something that we personally can own that actually adheres to that ideal. Yep, richer today than I was yesterday, and I'll be richer tomorrow. So there is, I would say, definitely that kind of appeal. You see UK economic growth over a period from the late 40s up until 2011. If you look at it up close, you can see that it's really not the kind of just standard upward trajectory that we're accustomed to seeing, but a lot more volatile and up and down than one might expect, which I would say has been increasingly the case since, at least 2008. One financial crisis, which I'm going to talk about, and also the COVID years as well. Think of the economic volatility and instability we saw during those years. So it certainly isn't the kind of smooth upward path that we might be led to believe, but rather a lot more erratic than that. We'll take a look then at the 2008 financial crisis and sort of understand a little bit what happened here, because here was something where housing was centrally involved, where real estate was a major factor. mentioned this previously. A lot of the time it's actually banks that own houses. Why? Well, because individual people can't actually afford to purchase homes. Homes, by and large, are too expensive for the average person. So you have this individual over here, John, and he wants to buy a house. House is, say, $150,000 or maybe a bit more, depending on his savings. And so he goes to the bank and says, I want to purchase this home. I don't have the money. And thus the bank lends him this money, this $150,000. Now, the bank just has that money to give because it is a financial institution. So it has access to this money. But to a degree, that $150,000 does not exist in the real world as yet. But it will exist in the future because John has to earn that money. So when you go to the bank and get a mortgage, you're basically involved in this kind of IOU process where you are going to make that money over whatever period of time. 10 years, 20 years, 40 years in some cases, depending on how long the mortgage might be. And this is why banks love mortgages, because they provide a steady stream of income. Every single month, you have to make the payment on the mortgage. That is a number that will show up on your bill every single month, and it's kind of like being beholden to the mafia, right? There's this idea of, I don't care how you get that money. It doesn't matter to me at all what's going on in your life. You just better get it every month, right? It doesn't matter how you're getting it. You just have to be getting it one way or another. Here's so you see a flow chart. I won't go through this in detail, but basically this shows what the bank does after it okays the loan. Because the bank is owed that money, it regards it as an asset. That's basically the key idea. This $150,000 is something the bank can expect to receive on a monthly basis, and so it is basically expecting that money, and then it does all sorts of things like taking the mortgages and putting them into investment banks. Problem is that banks might love mortgages a bit too much. They might have a little bit too much incentive to extend mortgages to people because they're basically getting this guaranteed amount of income from the customer. Because again, the bank is lending you the money, but it already has the money because it's a financial institution. The bank doesn't have to make the money as such. It already has it on hand. No, you have to make the money, right? That's the key point. And so they started in 2007 and 2008, extending mortgages increasingly to people who were actually unable to pay them. And this led up to the 2008 crisis. Say there, in the lead up to the 2008 crisis, banks began allowing people to purchase houses with little money down and low initial monthly payments. This practice gave birth to a rush of subprime mortgages, particularly in the United States. Usually when you go to the bank to secure a mortgage, you'll talk to the person who is handling the loan, and they will ask you about your income and your job, and they'll probably also do a bit of a character assessment as well. They want to see if you're a reliable person who can actually be counted on to pay this money back. But around 2007 and 2008, banks became much laxer about who they were giving mortgages to. And it's partly, again, the kind of mafia thing. It's all profit anyway when you get down to it. So it doesn't really matter if the customer can't pay back all of the mortgage. They will at least try to pay back some of it. So there's always going to be cash flowing into the bank one way or the other. Again, the financial institution doesn't have to make that money. It already just has it to loan the individual. So the incentive there is definitely in the direction of extending mortgages to people. What started to happen is individuals would get mortgages with low initial payments, and there'd be this kind of assumption, well, you'll be able to afford higher payments down the line. You'll be making more money, have a better job. That promotion will come through because, of course, again, we're on this kind of upward trajectory. Things are going to be better in the future. That was the kind of story. Well, when that proved not to be the case, basically what you had is a whole bunch of people who were unable to pay back the mortgages. You see, by 2006, 70% of the new mortgages offered in the United States were subprime, and between 2005 and 2006, $2 trillion worth of unconventional mortgages were issued in the United States, which you can see there. was having a kind of effect on the rest of the economy because you had a lot of assets being generated which weren't really solid and tangible. A couple of just cartoons there giving you a sense of the role of subprime mortgages on this kind of undergirding structure which was starting to fail. So yeah, I'll take the break now and speak a little bit more about this afterwards.